Hello, we're live now, Miguel. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thais Christopher Silva, and as you probably can guess from my accent, I am Brazilian. And I and many other Brazilians are very sorry the Brazilian has contributed to make the pandemic worse. And unfortunately, we close to 300,000 deaths, that loads of them could be avoided. But we have a very irresponsible government. But Brazil is not that government. And one thing you can guess is the Abralin Ao Vivo series that has contributed immensely to make our community stronger. So we apologize, Abralin, and I think most Brazilians would apologize for the trouble we are causing to the world and to all our friends, Brazilian friends, and for this tragic situation we let ourselves in by having a terrible president as we do. Of course, Joan Bybee doesn't need an introduction, but I was very pleased to be invited to introduce Joan to the Abralin Ao Vivo series, to which I and Miguel and everyone else thank you for, Joan. Joan's contribution to linguistics cover a wide range of subjects. And to my understanding, it is in phonology, morphology, and language variation and change, where she has made the most important theoretical contributions. In 1972, she pointed out to the relevance of the syllable to model phonological phenomena, a paper published in Language. And it was not until so many years later that John Goldsmith, in 1990, and many others, would propose a multi-level model of the syllable. Of course, at that time, she didn't have a model for the syllable, but she showed how important it was to take the syllable into account to model phonology. And she was definitely ahead of her time. In 1976, she published the Natural Generative Phonology Model by Academic Press, in which she challenged the generative phonology views by questioning the high degree of abstraction of representations, suggesting a model where phonological generalizations would have a closer relationship to surface forms. And that was published by Academic Press. The evolution of grammar, tense, aspect, and modality in languages of the world was co-authored by Perkins and Pagliuca, and it was published by the Chicago University Press in 1984, puts forward a new theory of evolution of grammar that links structure and meaning. The proposal presented in this book has implications for the development of language and the study of cognitive processes in general. It's her most cited and translated book. Joan Bybee's contribution to morphology is crucial. In her book, Morphology, a study of the relation between meaning and form, published by John Benjamin in 1985, presents a network model to account for morphological and morphophonological phenomena. I believe morphology exemplified the first move to a dynamic and complex theoretical model, which she developed further in later work, refinement of which is still going on. In 2001, she published two seminal books, Phonology and Language Use by Cambridge University Press, and Frequency and the Emergence of Linguistic Structure by John Benjamin, co-authored by Paul Hopper. Both books contributed considerably to directing language studies, and more specifically phonology, towards experimental approaches designed to corroborate theoretical assumptions, which goes along to laboratory phonology, but laboratory phonology did not propose a model, whereas she did put this forward in the 2001 book. Phonology and Language Use was a watershed publication which brought exemplar models into phonology. Although Keith Johnson had previously published a paper on exemplar models in 1997, it was in phonology and language use that Joan demonstrated that modeling language with exemplars could offer an interesting and promising line of research. Frequency effects were considered in a number of case studies, offering evidence for the gradual implementation of sound change in the lexicon. She, however, went further by proposing that phonetic detail is part of phonological representation, by offering evidence for the gradual phonetic implementation of phonetically motivated sound changes. Of course, analogical changes are abrupt. Joan deserves full credit for introducing exemplar models to phonology. An important discussion about the nature of phonological representation is presented in Chapter 3 of Phonology and Language Use. Inspired by Joan's exemplar and network models, I and my colleague, Cristina Gomes from UFRJ, in 2005 labeled a combination of these models as multi-representational models in phonology, which assumes that representational network diagrams express the interconnection of several levels of phonological representations, from motor production of speech to words or constructions. In 2010, Bybee published another seminal work which models grammar knowledge within a dynamic and complex theoretical perspective. Language Usage and Cognition was published by Cambridge University Press. This book was translated into Portuguese and published in Brazil in 2016 by Editora Cortez. In 2015, the Inspirational Language and Language Change by Cambridge University Press was published. In there, she offers a guide to different types of changes at different levels of linguistic structure, as well as the mechanisms behind each type of change. As with other work, wide empirical evidence supports her theoretical propositions, which was a great beauty about Joan's work. The Portuguese translation of this book, Language Change, was also published in Brazil by Editora Vozes. In all books cited, her writing is clear, concise, and pleasant to read, like a novel. You can't stop reading it. Whilst she also has made very important theoretical contributions in several published papers, you can, of course, find in her CV. Bybee's work has changed and evolved throughout the years and offers an important view on grammatical knowledge and grammar evolution and change. I would say her current views on grammar and how it evolves form part of a challenging and promising perspective, which I believe will continue to be considered in the years to come. Besides the prolific academic work, she also finds the time to play the piano wonderfully, and I had a pleasure to see her playing, and it was really beautiful. And she also looks after her beautiful ranch in New Mexico, and she's a great holiday companion. We had planned to go to Grand Canyon last year, but this has to wait, but I'm looking forward to that one as well. Today's talk is entitled Joint Innovation, Integrating Speaker and Listener in a Theory of Sound Change. And I would like to offer our deep gratitude to Joan for accepting the Abralina ao Vivo invitation. The word with you, Joan. Thank you very much. Oops. I think it's your turn now, Joan.
Okay, I'm working on
Miguel?
it. I've got it.
Okay.
Well, Thais, thank you so much for your introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here talking to Abraleen in this series that has gained so much prestige in the last year. I'm going to, well, I thank Thais for mentioning a number of things that I've worked on, because this talk is a continuation of many of my interests, and it's some theoretical musings. It's not a particular analysis of any one phenomenon, but it's some musings, some ideas about how about sound change, how it gets started and spreads. So my term joint innovation will be what I'll be explaining here. Now, on analogy with biological evolution, a number of prominent scholars have proposed that that change occurs in two steps. So Lindblom et al. Proposed that sound change occurs by first variation and then selection of variants. Croft, in his book on language change, proposes that change occurs as an altered replication, that is, some individual producing an innovative form, and then selection by speakers in the speech community. With respect to people who are studying sound change in the current climate, we have statements by Stevens and Harrington that say, an ongoing challenge in sound change research is to link the initiation of sound change within individual cognitive grammars to the diffusion of novel variants through the community. So again, a two-step model. Now, since all of us who are interested in sound change have never actually observed the exact moment that a sound change is initiated, researchers construct scenarios based on various types of errors that might occur in speaking and comprehending. So here are some examples, the most popular and famous of which was proposed by John Ohala, actually way before 2003, but maybe in the 80s, and something he continued to discuss. And that is that sound change is initiated by misperception. That would be the listener basically misanalyzing what he or she has heard. This is also phrased as coordination failure by Bermuda Sotero, or then some other things like in a paper with Baker and others, excessive production associated with spurious social factors. So another way to talk about this, and I believe that Janda and Joseph share the view, for example, of Ohala, they call it the Big Bang Theory. The innovation or initiation taking place in a single individual is abrupt. And then to quote them, sound change originates in very small, highly localized context over a relatively short temporal span. So in all of these versions of a theory, there's some kind of problem that occurs abruptly and leads to a sound change. And these theories seem to suppose that individuals can innovate on their own, and that different individuals within a community can have different grammars. Now, I do believe it's correct that individuals within a community can have different grammars. It's not just because they have different experience, but because, as Eva Dobrowski has shown, some in morphosyntax, people can come up with different analyses. Now, I'm going to comment later on why I don't think that's the case with phonetics and change that starts in phonetic variation. But these theories are based on the proposition that individuals can have different grammars. And then an innovation they make because of that grammar can spread to other speakers. Now, in a usage-based conception, language users register the range of variation that's present in their experience. And to the extent that users share experience, their cognitive representations, especially of phonetics, will be similar and overlapping. Now, what I'm suggesting, though, is that speaker and listener are acting together when change occurs. And that's why I call this joint innovation. So in this presentation, I will propose that the link between the speaker and the listener, and indeed the individual and the community, is much tighter than these models assume. And I'll try to present some evidence for that. I argue that we do not need to distinguish innovation from spread, and we do not need to identify a one-time event for innovation. So in this model, sound change can be gradual in every sense. Now, there are two basic theoretical predispositions of my own that underlie this proposal. One is that I view grammar as emergent and changing, dynamic. There are no discrete boundaries in the language system. So the dichotomies that we propose as linguists and find useful at times, such as phonetics and phonology, morphology and syntax, grammar versus usage, semantics and pragmatics, they have no clear dividing lines. And my second predisposition or assumption, well, it's predisposition because it's based on evidence from other types of change, such as grammaticalization. These types of change are gradual, and they take place through events, usage events, in which the speaker and listener are cooperating and share the same knowledge. Now, taking the distinction between phonetics and phonology for a moment, one reason that the initiation of sound change is often thought to be abrupt in a single event is that it is assumed that a phonetic change has to jump over the line between phonetics and phonology. So it has to be phonologized. Yet, many who examine the proposed distinction between phonetics and phonology are forced to conclude that it's not clear where to draw the line. So if we don't have a strict line between phonetics and phonology, then a sound change is actually starting in the phonetics and very gradually moving into the phonology. So what gets a sound change started? Well, if we have this view of a continuum from fine phonetic distinctions to phonologized categories, then sound change would start in the ubiquitous phonetic variation that accompanies all speech. In fact, most researchers agree that the source of sound change is in the pool of phonetic variation. In that phonetic variation, there are individual characteristics, that is, to specific speakers, but overall, the range of variation is quite small and regular within a speech community. In fact, Labov defines a speech community as one in which there is regularity among the characteristics displayed by the speakers. So the question again becomes, do we need a special event of misperception or other error to get sound change started? Well, first we should say, oh, sorry about that little thing there. We should say, what do we mean by sound change? Because there are really different kinds of changes in sounds. And the type of sound change I'll be addressing has these characteristics. And I have discussed this in a paper in 2012 and shown how these particular characteristics occur together and adhere to what we consider to be what really is the largest class of sound changes. These are phonetically motivated, usually gestural reduction or retiming. They're cross-linguistically common and unidirectional. I'll give you some examples in a minute. Phonetically gradual. Lexically gradual, that is affecting different lexical items at different times, but often regular in the end. This type of change affects both words and phrases in the initial stages. So it's not word bound, it can go across word boundaries. and it can create novel segment types. Say, creating alveopalatal affricate from a stop, from a T, for example. And it occurs internal to a speech community. So here are a few examples. I'm not going to discuss them in detail, but just so you have in mind what I'm thinking of. Vowel nasalization before a nasal consonant with reduction and loss of that consonant. This occurs in different languages at different times. For example, in Romance languages, Portuguese is a great example. Also, it's occurring currently in English and has been well studied by Patrice Bedore. It is unidirectional. It almost always goes in the direction of vowel nasalization with loss of the consonant and not in the opposite direction. Another example that's well studied today, the fronting of a high back vowel, an U becoming U. This occurred in French, for example. It's ongoing in both British and American dialects. It's been studied by Labov and Harrington and his colleagues. It's gradual. It's common for a high back vowel to front. It's not common for a front vowel to go to the back. So it's unidirectional also, and gradual. Okay, then another one that maybe you haven't heard so much about, but I've been noticing a lot in American English, is the retraction of S before TR. So in a word like stream, you get an esh, stream, by some, especially younger speakers. This has been studied by Baker in American English. And of course, we know of such changes from Germanic languages. So those are the type of sound change that I'm thinking of. Okay. Now, Thais mentioned the model of exemplar representations, which is now being accepted by a lot of researchers. It's very important to my view of sound change. And in fact, I came to this notion of exemplar representation through thinking about sound change. So in traditional phonemic theory and generative theory, we assume that cognitive representations of speech require abstract segments. They're phonemes. And a lot of evidence has emerged lately to demonstrate that language users record phonetic detail in their cognitive representations, not just abstract phonemes. And I'll be giving you more evidence today that that's the case. And in this model then, phonetically similar tokens of experienced words are organized into exemplars. And the exemplars are organized into clusters based on phonetic similarity. So there is categorization. It's not like everything is just scattered all over the lexicon. There are tight categories formed based on phonetic similarity. So all the experienced tokens of a word can be assigned to exemplars. For example, a word such as English memory could have 3 exemplars, one with 3 syllables, memory, one with a syllabic R, memory, memory, and one with just 2 syllables, memory. The evidence presented for exemplar representation, the evidence that I presented early on, was had to do with lexically specific variation. That is, the fact that some words have phonetic variation that's not necessarily predictable by phonetic rule, or it's more extreme, for example, than that predicted by phonetic rule. And so that includes the notion of lexical diffusion, which is the way a sound change travels through lexical items. Now, a second set of evidence for exemplar representations presented in the sociophonetic literature, it's found that there's phonetic detail in social and regional dialects that's known and used by the speakers of these dialects to recognize people, and basically to understand all of the dynamics of the phonetic variation in their community. So folks in Doherty show that within a single community, older men, women, and children all display systematically different ranges of phonetic variation, which overlap. They're not totally different. But this is part of the knowledge that the speakers have about their dialect. And this also demonstrates that exemplars are associated in memory with phonetic context as well as social and stylistic context. So a lot of knowledge, but it's the knowledge speakers have, and it's important for us to recognize it. So rather than language users having discrete phonemic representations, the cognitive representations of words are clusters of exemplars representing a range of variation. So speakers with similar experience have very similar ranges of phonetic variation. Change takes place when some variants become more common than others. So my goal in the rest of this presentation is to argue that with this conception of phonetic representation, we don't need to make those distinctions between speaker and listener and sound change, and we don't need to explain community spread as separate from innovation. So I'm going to present two types of arguments. Argument one is that speech is a highly practiced, highly skilled activity. This applies both to motor production and to perception and comprehension. My second argument is that the speaker and listener are participating in a highly coordinated, cooperative process. Okay, so first about skilled activity. Playing the piano is a highly skilled behavior. I know something about this, as Thais mentioned, and I think about how the skill of playing a piano is similar to the skill of speaking a language. We know that skill arises through practice, repetition, frequency. And the results of practice in music is a fluent performance. Also greater speed. You start out having to play kind of slowly, then with practice, speed can become enhanced. But that's not all. What's actually more important is control, the control that allows for expressiveness. So, for example, in music, you need to get louder or softer. That's crescendo, decrescendo, accelerando. You need to accelerate. You can slow down, and you need to slow down in some cases. Rubato is slowing and accelerating through a phrase. Staccato is a type of touch on the piano. Legato is another type. Those are the things that you're getting from practice, not just greater speed, not just fluency, but the control that allows you to actually make it music. Well, how does this translate into speech? Well, highly practiced sequences of actions come to be processed as chunks, which are autonomized. And that's true of playing the piano. It's also true, as we know, of speech. Automatized chunks can be utilized while the conscious focus is on the content. Now, also, it's important to remember that chunks do not entirely lose their internal structure. Even automated units can be manipulated for focus, for emphasis, backgrounding, and other expressive purposes. So an important skill in language use is the ability to manipulate articulation for a variety of effects. And this is phonetic manipulation. Now, to remind you that skilled language behavior arises within a speech community. So fundamental to the human ability to communicate with language is a finely tuned social cognition that includes joint attention and understanding of others' intentions, as Tomasello has pointed out. In interaction, as well as in acquisition, recent studies identify a role for imitation, which distinguishes, by the way, human language from communication in other species. And this imitation is finely tuned, as we know, from the fact that children grow up and speak a language in just the way, at least phonetically, their peers do. Accommodation is another important factor in our ability to communicate, as shown in various studies. When people are speaking with someone who has a slightly different, say, vowel system, the speaker will accommodate to that by changing his or her vowels in very small increments. There's also entrainment and movement synchrony, where we find that people tend to synchronize with one another in their movements, in speaking, but also in dancing, in music, in clapping in an audience. So there's this tendency to entrain or synchronize movements. And all of this affects the, I'm sorry, shouldn't have done that yet. All of this affects the way speakers within a community converge to have very similar phonetic properties. Now, the place that all this takes place is within conversations. So if speakers within a conversation imitate and accommodate, the result over multiple repetitions is a set of very similar motor patterns in members of community. Within a conversation, which is where sound change takes place, the speaker and listener are engaged with one another on multiple levels, including the phonetic. They're imitating, they're accommodating, they're synchronizing at a very fine level of detail. And so what I'm going to do here, there are a lot of ways to demonstrate this, but what I have chosen to do here is to talk about conversation and what's been learned by people who do conversational analysis. Well, one of the things we know is that there's the conversation, the cooperation in conversation is based on shared knowledge. And shared knowledge can be non-linguistic knowledge, of course, but it's also linguistic knowledge. Linguistic knowledge, there's a lot of linguistic knowledge that affects phonetic variation. Recent studies have shown that the frequency of a word, its prior probability, affects its phonetic shape. The probability of a word occurring in a certain context affects its phonetic shape, whether the word's been mentioned before. So in the following, I'm going to mention, in addition to that, 2 uses of phonetic variation in constructions. But first, I'm going to demonstrate that conversation is a cooperative activity. Research in conversation analysis has found that participants use phonetic and syntactic cues to determine when a turn ends, to finish each other's sentences, to co-construct clauses, and create what Gene Lerner calls a chorus of co-production. So it's not just a speaker and a hearer and they're just doing their own thing. They are working together. So here's an example from a paper by Ono and Thompson. So D says, they're talking about a book. This explains Judaism. And K says, not really. And D at the same time says, in big print. And then goes on to say, in 218 pages. So then K says, Greg got it. D says, that's nice. And then says, for your daughter. And K says, from the library. So the 2 of them co-construct a clause. Greg got it for your daughter from the library. Now, in order to do that, they had to both know one another's intentions. They had to know the syntax. They had to read the phonetics. Where is this conversation going, for example? So that's an example and when you look at conversation, you see lots of examples like that. Speaker and listener are the 2 co-participants working together to build a conversation. Now, what I want to talk about are phonetic correlates of constructions. And I'm going to give you 2 examples, as I said before. Excuse me. Now, we know that some constructions have intonational contours associated with them, and some have accent patterns and duration patterns. In a recent study that I did with a colleague who's from Brazil, Ricardo Napoleon de Souza, we show that the duration of the vowels in English adjectives differs according to whether they're in an attributive construction or a predicative construction. Attributive is like wet feed, so the adjective modifies a noun. Predicative is where the adjective is forming the predicative function, as in that's sad. So I think that's sad because that doesn't allow for individuality. In our study of about 1,000 tokens of 10 different adjectives, we found that construction type was significant in predicting vowel duration, along with lexical adjective and phonological factors you might expect. And the effect was independent of the prosodic effect conditioned by a following pause. So it wasn't just that predicative adjectives are longer because they're often at the end of a clause or before a pause where you slow down and lengthen, but in fact, in overall, this was a significant factor for construction type. So that means that one of the things speakers of English have to know and have to track in phonetics is the duration of the vowel in an adjective, and that gives them a clue to the type of construction that they're experiencing. Here's another slightly more subtle example where phonetic variation provides cues to the prosodic grouping the speaker wants to convey. This is from a study by Barth Weingarten and Cooper Kulin of tokens of two conjoined VPs in English conversation. These two conjoined VPs can represent two events and can be produced as two actions in the conversation, or they can represent one event and be produced as a single action in the conversation. So here's an example of the two VPs as one unit of conversation. So B is talking about her friend Dinah, who compulsively borrows money. She says, I was sitting in her house and Reg Oakley came and delivered something. She goes on to say that Dinah said she didn't have the change and she wanted to borrow money from B. Okay, well, our focus here is came and delivered. How is it produced phonetically? It's produced as one event. There are no pitch or tempo changes. The final pitch contour is on delivered. The first VP is not accented. And plus VP2 are in the same rhythmic foot. And is cliticized to VP1 and has a reduced vowel. So came and delivered is a unit, prosodic unit, and it's also intended to be one event. He didn't come and then he delivered something. In fact, the reason he came was to deliver something. So that was one event. And the speaker, the listener knows that because he or she can follow all of these detailed phonetic features. In contrast, if the two VPs are two events, then they're two units in conversation. So in another conversation, Chloe is talking to Claire about how frustrated she was in a recent bridge game, that's a card game, watching another player. And she says, I should get up and go to the bathroom or put on some makeup. That is because she's too frustrated sitting there. And in this case, she presents get up and go to the bathroom as two different events. So getting up is getting away from the card game, and then going to the bathroom is an excuse to get away. So in this instance, there was a pause before and, a glottal onset for and a pitch change. So all of these things give the listener cues, clues that they're two events. Now, in their study, they demonstrate that these are two extreme cases, and they're intermediate cases as well. Speakers can manipulate how they want the conjoined VPs to be interpreted. So in 96 instances of this Hindiadic construction, pitch reset and prosodic breaks around and correlate significantly with judgments of whether one event or two events are intended. This means that the speakers and listeners are attending to and interpreting prosodic breaks, pitch changes, glottal onsets, rhythmic feet, degrees of accent, degrees of vowel reduction. It's a lot, but that's what we do when we converse with one another. Now, of course, speakers are listeners and listeners are speakers, and this has been emphasized lately in papers on sound change. For example, in the Bidor study with her colleagues that's mentioned here, she looks at in very fine detail at how people comprehend nasalized vowel followed by a nasal consonant and how they produce it. And she finds a tight interaction with individual speakers that their variation in production is correlated with their variation in perception. And of course, speakers and listeners are equally skilled at both tasks, and the two tasks feed into one another through the cooperative activity of conversing. Now, with regard to the way sound change occurs, Lynn Bloom and his colleagues in 1995 point out that patterns of hypo and hyperarticulation are conventionalized in a community. And many studies show that community members have overlapping ranges of variation. Because speakers within a community have similar production routines, as they compress and reduce these routines, the result is fairly consistent across speakers. So for example, within a speech community, if T is undergoing reduction between vowels, what does not happen is that one speaker produces a glottal stop, another one produces a D, somebody else produces a flap, and somebody else a fricative. Now, all those things can happen in different languages, but they don't happen in the same speech community. Rather, for all the reasons just mentioned, the direction of reduction is the same among speakers who regularly converse with one another. One final example, a small change in a pattern, usually towards hypoarticulation, that's reduction or assimilation, does not need to occur in one individual and then spread to others, but can occur at approximately the same time across a group of individuals. The existing patterns of gestural movement hold within them the seeds of change, and these patterns are shared. So in this example, Baker and colleagues studied S retraction in English STRA clusters. They could identify speakers who were retractors, that's shown on the right, and speakers who were non-retractors on the left by the height of the middle column. But what their results showed was that even the people they considered to be non-retractors were retracting to some extent. And that's why that middle bar on the left is lower than the top one. So even though it appears that some speakers are making a change and others are not, in fact, the change is very gradual, and probably most people in the speech community are participating. So my conclusions. Language users are highly skilled at what they do. Their skills are highly entrenched. This allows them to manipulate both the grammar and the phonetics of their utterance for expressive effects. Conversing is a cooperative activity based on shared knowledge, skills, and goals. Patterns of conversation are highly conventionalized. It seems to me unlikely that an error would become incorporated into the individual skills or the conventional patterns. Rather, it seems more likely that change arises precisely from the shared conventions of language use. The theories that require this two-step process of innovation and spread envision sound change in grammar, where grammar is an abstraction. But in usage-based theory, the grammar is the cognitive representation of experience with language. And the degree of abstraction is a matter of empirical verification. In the case of phonetics, we have already seen that there's not a lot of abstraction. There is categorization, but in fact, people are able to track phonetics very carefully. And therefore, the probability that they might have different grammars is small. Exemplar theory recognizes that phonetic detail is important to the use of language, and that speaker and hearer share a great deal of knowledge about the context for phonetic variation. Language users with shared production and perception systems have the same tendencies toward hyper and hypo articulation. So, as conversing is a cooperative, not a competitive activity, these tendencies can produce innovations that are shared from the very beginning. Thank you very much. I hope you have some questions and comments. You might have to help me stop sharing my screen.
Miguel?
Or Miguel could perhaps do that.
Yeah, I mean, you can leave it on because we may have to go back to it. I don't know. I think you have probably to go to the keynote. Let me see if I am. No. For some reason, I can't see if I'm online now. I'm having a look on my YouTube and.
I can see you.
Online here? Yeah, I can see you. Oh, well. Let me go back here. We have two questions. One that has nothing to do with your talk, and the other one I think that has to do with your talk. So I'm going to ask you that one first. And the question is, it's by Daniela Oliveira. She was my PhD student, and her PhD was on language acquisition. And now she works with orthography as well. So her question is it possible in a usage-based model to incorporate the influence of orthography in representation in the mental lexicon? The form of written words, the form of written words can have an impact in language variation and change?
Yes, of course, because our, in literate societies, part of our experience with language, a large part of it is through the written version and through orthography. And of course, anybody who has thought about that realizes how difficult it is to figure out what kind of representation there is and what kind of connection between the written word and the exemplar clusters. But of course, orthography can have effects, and we know of examples. For example, the pronunciation in English of the word OFTEN is often with no T. There was a sound change long ago that got rid of that T. And yet there are many speakers, especially I know in the US, but I think elsewhere too, who say often. And they had to get that from the spelling because that T in pronunciation is long gone, centuries ago. So there are examples like that, yes. So orthography is part of our experience.
Yeah, in part of mental representations. I think that was her question. I think she was probably thinking cases like, his work, Marco Antonio de Oliveira's work on pretonic vowel raise. And it's very interesting because we raise in Brazilian Portuguese many pretonic vowels, like something like perigo, for danger, we say perigo. But some words, like words that are more formal, like privilege, which is privilégio, it should be with an E, not with an E. So we say it's very common to hear people saying privilégio, although they have the orthography, they use something that's more abstract. No, this case actually wasn't a good example because it was the other way around. People do change.
Hypercorrection.
Yeah, this is a case of hypercorrection, but there are cases where a case which is common is we get rid of the R final in verbs. And when kids start learning how to write, they get that back because they get that from spelling. So I think it was along those lines she was thinking. But it's good to hear that you assume that orthography is part of the mental representation. The other question is by Nayara Macedo, and she asks, could you tell us about cognitive studies in phraseology? I don't think it has anything to do with your talk particularly, but if you have anything to say about this. Oh, we have some questions, more questions now.
I don't know what's meant by phraseology.
Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah.
Well,
So yeah, if you want to clarify, Niara, in the chat, I'll get back to John. The other question is by Rajan Sen, is do you then reject the notion of outright misperception like Blevin's change in continuous? Is there a distinction to be drawn between reanalysis and phonologization in types of change? Where does the current account leave the reanalysis?
It's two questions, right?
Yeah, two questions. Yeah, I thought it was continuing because just right in the chat.
So yeah, I disagree with Blevins and Ohala. Now there are some very well-defined cases which are the ones that Ohala brought up, where you've got some compensation in perception for the context. And but that cannot be generalized to all sorts of sound change, for example. It just doesn't generalize to, say, reductions and lenition. So I do disagree with that. Now I forgot. Okay.
Yeah, is there a distinction to?
Let me say something else about misperception.
Okay.
Because in all the cases where you could cite misperception, there's also the possibility of an articulatory explanation. I mean, they just go together. And so so you could just choose, oh, I prefer misperception as the exam, as the explanation, but I've tried to show that I don't think misperception is very common, and I don't think changes are abrupt like that. So that's my part of my argument, and there are more arguments in that 2012 paper I cited. Now, what about reanalysis? Well, I've studied reanalysis in grammaticalization, for example, and I've studied it in sound change, and I do think that reanalysis is gradual. And you only see reanalysis if you look at a beginning point and an end point. So you might look at an earlier stage of Portuguese and you say, oh, we have nasalized vowels before nasal consonants. And then you look at an end stage and you say, oh, we have phonemes, nasal vowels or phonemes. Well, it doesn't mean there was a big jump somewhere. There was a very, very gradual, for example, loss of the nasal consonant, and the reanalysis can occur even before the nasal consonant is deleted, as, for example, in American English, where one can identify a word with a nasal vowel when there's no nasal consonant there, but you can't identify it if you don't have the nasal vowel and you just have the nasal consonant. So the nasalization in English is terribly important already, even though technically it's not phonemic. So I think it's all gradual. That's what I think.
Good.
Is that clear enough?
Yes, I think it is. Chiara Paolini has a question for you. Do you think it's possible to consider joint innovation even for morphological change, nouns formation from suffixed and compound words? I think the question is about joint innovation in morphology.
Well, I do think that joint innovation occurs in grammaticalization. And when there's meaning change and also the structural changes that go along with it, which again is a long gradual process. And speakers, there's a range of variation, but speakers are very much in tune with one another on what inferences they can make, what things mean, what the contexts of use are. Now, with more strictly morphological change, such as analogical change, that you might see in nonce word experiments, I think you probably can get some joint innovation in the sense that while speakers, you do see differences in places where morphology is very irregular. You see differences in the way people make their generalizations, but they could be influenced by the forms that they hear from other people, of course, and adopt forms that are innovative that other speakers have produced. But they wouldn't do that unless it made sense in terms of their own cognitive representations.
Right. We have a question by Eureka Meyer. How can the theory of sound change affect our work with and teaching pronunciation? I didn't follow that.
No, I get it. So the idea that there's a lot of accommodation and imitation means, well, it helps us understand that in fact repetition is terribly important in teaching good pronunciation in a foreign language, or a second language, sorry. But there's only so far you can go. So that's one reason that I think this type of change I'm talking about occurs within, internal to a speech community. And so not across bilinguals necessarily, not even across different dialects. Adaptation to a different dialect might be a different kind of process.
Right. I don't think there is any more questions, but I have a question regarding teaching of pronunciation. Just follow up on that question. In our first language, we have strong exemplars. And of course, we have our grammar there. When you start with a second language, you have very few exemplars. So you need practice, experience to build something that you'll be able to juggle with the two languages. But somehow, even in the initial states of L2 acquisition, you link with your L1. How do we associate these things? Because of course, articulation, we articulate as L1 and we perceive as L1. What would make us adapt to create an L2 grammar? I don't know if it makes sense, this question.
Well, what would make us do it? Would our motivation be? Well, to try to sound like try to speak a language better. But what it really takes is enough exposure and practice to develop an independent set of articulatory routines that you move into when you use the other language. And that we all know from a lot of experience that is very hard to do. And it takes a lot of exposure and practice. And even conscious effort, right?
Yeah. So I have a question now about whether or not sound change or change in general can go back. And for what you've said and other people have said, it's not. If anything comes up, it's going to be something new. You can't go back in time. There is only the future. And I'll give you an example about Brazilian Portuguese. As you've mentioned it, Brazilian Portuguese had a vowel, oral vowel, followed by a nasal consonant. And that nasal consonant nasalized the vowel and disappeared. So something that's spelled as S-I-M, we say sim, not sim. Right. And you have a nasal vowel. Interestingly, now it's starting a process of word final vowel devoicing and loss. So you lose the vowel. So something like fome can be fome, to com fome. Or when you say come here, say vam, and you end it with a nasal vowel that you shouldn't in principle. So in my understanding, that's a new thing. So it's not going back in time. So I would like to hear what your views are on this. Is it a new thing or it's going back?
Sure. It's
And
it's caused by the loss of the vowel, right?
Yeah, no, but we nasalize the preceding vowel, like vamos, we nasalize the vowel.
Oh, when
like,
when the nasal is in the same, loss of the vowel causes the nasal to be in the same syllable as the vowel that's still there, that vowel nasalizes.
But now we are doing it with the vowel, the consonant that follows is in the following syllable. And we nasalize the vowel, and we are going to have something like a nasal vowel followed by a consonant, which we shouldn't. But I think it's an innovation that
it's a new development, and but it is interesting how languages can have the same sort of change occurring more than once in history. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that was actually what I wanted to say, that you may have this thing, it's not repeating itself, but it's a new thing.
But all of the gestural routines that you have already, then if they're given a new context, they sort of operate in the way they might operate in the way they did in the past. They don't always, of course, but they might.
Yeah. Let me see if there is any more questions here. No, then I have a question that's in, yesterday I was listening to Marco Antonio de Oliveira, and he made a statement which he has made in his papers, which is the individual is more homogeneous in his or her pronunciation than the community, meaning that the community varies more, but the individual doesn't vary. What would be your views on that?
Well, I just reread a paper by William Labov from 1989 about the Philadelphia as a speech community. And it's a very long paper with a lot of detail about a particular very, very complicated vowel raising. And what he found was the community was more regular than the individual. That is, and I thought that was really interesting. Now, I don't know if all communities are that way or all types of variation are the same, but I have a feeling Labov would disagree with that. And I have to go with people who have a lot of experience with sociolinguistics because I do not. So I can only guess, but I thought that was a very interesting contribution by Labov.
Yeah, I'll go back to that paper and share it with Marco Antonio as well. My last question now is a criticism that I myself and other colleagues who've worked with exemplar models had, is that we don't model representation. We talk about abstract representations, but we don't offer a specific model to put down to paper with exemplar models like clouds or exemplars. Or so do you have any idea on how things will develop to model exemplar models?
Well, that may not be a fair criticism, actually. I think that, well, one has to point out that linguists who like models never make a complete model anyway. I mean, there's no model that can do even the smallest things correctly. So I think modeling is overrated. But I don't think that we don't do models. I have papers where I have little diagrams of things that are like models, and I really don't think that that's a fair criticism, frankly.
Yeah. My answer to these questions is I use the diagrams you use, but I think also experimental work and results shown in graphs that numerically express
Right.
phonetic detail or any other frequency effects, offer these representation in a different way than making tableaus or rules, or which I think some of my colleagues expected.
Oh,
So
yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Like that wonderful paper by Folks and Doherty has lots and lots of schematic, has
yeah,
tables and graphs, and you get from that you get a perfectly good idea of
yeah,
how what the speakers are doing in that community.
yeah. Yeah, I don't think we have any more questions. If anybody has a question, add it now there to the chat, but no one seems to have done. So on behalf of Aberlin, I would like to thank you, Joan, for being with us this afternoon. And yeah, I hope we all be able to see each other in the future in presence once we all get vaccinated and the pandemic is gone. Oh,
Well,
thank you. Do you have any words to say?
Yeah, let me thank you, Thais, for making this pleasant and fun for me. And let me thank Aberline and everybody who's participated. And if anyone should have questions for me, feel free to send me an email and I'll be glad to send you an answer. So goodbye to all my friends in Brazil, and let's hope we do meet up again in person sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye. I think we